involves two of the most devious things human beings have ever come upon.
Returning back to nonviolent communication, we can see its ideological roots, how it relates to the subjectivity and moral relativism of existentialism and postmodernism, the emphasis on language and structure from structuralism and modern linguistics, the emphasis on group dynamics from the New Age and analytical systems theory, and the power dynamic in feminism and cultural Marxism, all of which backs the control system. To add to this, we see pragmatism in terms of getting what you want from people, hypnosis through indirect language as keeping people in a trance-like state geared towards feelings makes people receptive to your control. Rosenberg obviously uses this to sell his NVC ideas to make a living. This is indicative of the human potential movement, which desired to package manipulative psychological tricks like NLP into financial careers. We see the obvious constructivism of progressive education in terms of reframing reality in a self-serving way and in a way that promotes the so-called authority of the environment. We see MKUltra influence as mind control as the principal method of government power, and we saw diabolical doctors like Ewan Cameron destroy lives with forced shock electrotherapy mentioned in the Esalen Library. Esalen funded by the Tavistock Institute. What better way to have a totalitarian takeover than to remove mental discernment from people and regress them to childlike behaviors? Humanistic psychology is indeed prominent in NVC as the belief that no one has more knowledge than you and that there is nothing to teach or learn. This is the pathological feminine, in which life is all about expression and connection. In the cultish aspects of NVC, there is an aversion to judgment and conflict as it disrupts the collective cohesion, and so they seek to resolve conflict on the surface so that the illusion of peace is kept and the feminine archetype of harmony is maintained. While in communication conflict can emerge when one person is being mean to another person, more often than not, conflict is simply disagreement. NVC defines honest self-expression as expressing oneself in a way that is likely to inspire compassion in others, but this assumes that honesty will always be in agreement with others, and that we should always believe what other people say. What if our disagreement conflicts with another's need for agreement? What if their need for agreement disagrees with our need to be honest? Here's an example where needs can be different and how honesty can conflict with needs. By seeing conflict as existing in the structure of communication rather than content, NVC provides the so-called language of conflict resolution. Recall that NVC sees all communication to be good in the form of universal needs, which again is a dangerous assumption. The naive belief about human goodness keeps one blind from their own dark side and other people's dark side, which leads them to get taken advantage of or to take advantage of. Particularly in cults, people can be incredibly blind to the reality of its members, seeking to simply feel good and to see each other always in a positive light. Before we continue with the subject of conflict, let's make it very clear that we are not talking about physical conflict or threat, but conflict that emerges from our associations and interactions. While no one should be around a person that puts them down all the time, or be in a verbally abusive relationship, conflict as disagreement carries a different value than simply unpleasantry. While Nietzsche's perspectivism desired to make all perspectives true, in a non-contradictory reality, this cannot be the case. It is actually possible that one person could be right and another person could be wrong, a possibility NVC would rather deny. NVC places all conflict between people, when the greater conflicts can actually lie within a person. In terms of self-development, conflict can alert us to where we are not in alignment with truth, revealing inner fragmentation and confusion, such as the conflict between thoughts and feelings, or between thoughts and actions, or between feelings and actions. Conflict can alert us to the fact that our current worldview and way of understanding is not sufficient for the data we receive. Because of this, conflict can be an important catalyst for growth. Since NVC ignores all issues of mind, it fails to see that conflict can be the contradiction between two particular assertions that should be evaluated using the Socratic method. Contradictions arise because of ignorance and the lack of understanding, as no real conflict and contradiction exist in the nature and the structure of reality itself. Most people deny and run away from this dissonance, but the seeker of truth will be motivated to learn more and get to the bottom of things. If we are in contradiction, then we cannot be aligned to truth, and there is something false about our worldview that should be examined and eliminated. Gaining knowledge to resolve conflict takes a lot of time and development, as there is no instant solution. However, NVC wants immediate results and magically poofs conflict out of existence with a focus on needs. Consequently, the mind can only be in a state of confusion with NVC, as there is no will and care to develop it, but to remain identified to one's feelings. Therefore, no contradictions can ever be examined with rational analysis. Ultimately, NVC is about comfort, not growth. While outer conflict will break down a person who has no inner unity and strength, it cannot affect the person who has resolved his own inner conflict. It is the trait of an adult to handle and face conflict with patience, courage, and self-control. It is when one is lost and cannot access truth that outer conflict breeds inner confusion. By simply seeing conflict as undesirable, NVC limits our understanding of the value of conflict, seeking to make us weak and pampered through artificial environments. Yet the mark of true spiritual development is to be able to handle anything said from anyone's mouth, when one's alignment with truth is rock solid. We should never seek to control language, but learn to control ourselves. By keeping people safe from conflict, NVC cultivates weakness, so that people become too weak to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world, too weak to wake up to their own psychological problems and the control system, since they can dismiss any undesirable information as violent communication. The truth actually feels violent to them, which is what makes NVC so dangerous. The dark occultists of the control system want us to conflate truth with violence, like war means peace from 1984. The reversal of meaning is an effective mind control, because the less truth we know, the more controlled we are. The four components of NVC are observation, feeling, need, and request. Here we see that observation free of judgment or discernment is considered the highest form of intelligence. This a misinterpretation of Krishnamurti as examined in Part 2. Here it implies that transcending conditioning is getting in touch with universal needs, a dangerous distortion of truth. Transcending social conditioning requires getting in touch with universal truth, as needs can be subjective. And here it conflates values with needs. Most of the New Age sees spiritual growth as a feeling rather than the alchemical growth of work of transforming the lead of the ego into the philosopher's gold. We shouldn't only be mere observers of our thoughts, feelings, and actions to passively accept them, as we should actively work with them to get them in alignment with the objective good. While NVC seeks to become aware of one's feelings and needs, it only does so under the pretense of objectivity, yet expressing feelings in an objective and neutral terms, factual observations of feelings and needs, while required as the first step in self-development, is not synonymous with true objectivity. And as needs and feelings can be based in false realities and can also bias our perception of reality. NVC assumes that your basic feelings and emotional needs are objectively valid and considers the identification of them and communication of them as the end goal. It is not that we should express our feelings without interpretation of judgment and impulsively make requests, but that we need to go through the process of self-examination to discover what is true and false, good and evil, right and wrong about these needs, to get to their core motivation, intention, and origin. And again, discovering where the need comes from cannot be done with a tool, but with the commitment to self-awareness, which meditation can help with. NVC describes violent and coercive language, which is simply the use of a violent strategy to meet needs with the 4 Ds. The 4 Ds are considered to be life-alienating communication, communication that blocks us from connecting with self and others, alienating us from our natural state of compassion, leading us to the states of mind that are defensive and aggressive. They are demand, deserve, diagnosis, and denial. Demands imply threat or punishment, like, get that proposal out by 5 p.m. or you'll be suspended. This is not just a language of punishment, but an actual threat of punishment. Unfortunately, our whole control system is based on the motivation for reward, greed, and punishment, fear, a false morality of obedience and control. We see this expressed worst in the order following of the military and police and other bureaucratic systems like taxation, and even the business model as a whole. If your boss asks you to do something, it's usually coupled with a threat that if you don't, you'll potentially be fired. We live in an immoral society where we are threatened with survival all the time and coerced to do things against our will. But in higher consciousness world, we would be motivated by care, truth, and goodness. But for now, humans are generally lazy and only motivated by self-interest. Thus, we get the world we deserve. While we cannot help some of the societal coercion, in our personal lives, if someone is using demands to control and dominate your life, like constantly giving you orders, this is obviously a bad relationship. Because NVC sees human nature as good, it sees that even the demands from an asshole are backed by good intentions, just strategically miscommunicated. Try changing the language of an asshole and you will see that it does not help. Sometimes a demand is the inappropriate expression of stress and other things going on with somebody, which may be good for them to express. But if a demanding, entitled person has no respect to begin with, then the change of the situation is probably to get out. People that use reward and punishment language to get people to do things are either super egotistical and self-centered or bad parents that have failed to install values in their children as to show them the real reasons they should do things. Like demands, another form of coercive language is deserve-oriented language. This links behavior with reward. And the example here is, if you don't get that project done, don't bother coming in tomorrow, which sounds exactly like a demand. Perhaps this is a bad example. Again, we could say that all business transactions and the money system at large are motivated by reward as the pragmatic game. You play this game and you'll get some cash. You do this and you'll get this. In a way, NVC New Age had a desire to form relationships without the strain of business transactions. But then they went from business boundaries to having no boundaries, which enters the cultish territory. Instead of using violent language, NVC suggests that we use requests to meet unmet needs and resolve conflict. If we never really examine needs and assume they are the same for everyone, does a request really differ from a demand? If we are constantly finding what we can ask of a person, is this not a form of control? Like feminism and cultural Marxism, NVC perceives language and conversation as structured with a culturally infected power dynamic. However, meet my needs can easily become the new power dynamic and ego game. Power and power dynamics are merely indicative of lower consciousness, as the lack of knowledge, self and cosmic, living blind in the materialist paradigm, where humans are motivated by ego and power, until they evolve spiritually to be motivated by love and truth. Because NVC does not discuss spiritual growth, any uncomfortable truth asserted could be perceived as a power dynamic. Anyone who claims to have more knowledge than another would be asserting a power dynamic. Thus, according to NVC, no one is allowed to diagnose another person. The example given for diagnosis, or more accurately, unrequested diagnosis, is you are lazy and only care about yourself. This is considered labeling, judging, or criticizing. NVC and the New Age believe that all labels are judgments and all judgments are labels, destroying the law of identity. This is simply saying that people cannot be anything negative, a childish belief. What if it is true that a person is actually lazy and that they actually only care about themselves? This doesn't mean that one should necessarily yell this at them, but the point is that there is no room for objective truth in the MVC model, as it deems all diagnosis as false when some criticisms can be true. This is the belief that you should not be talked to in a critical way unless given permission, to keep people safe from critical examination. Again, this is the destruction of the sacred masculine, to keep people in an infantile regressed state as trickery, hypersensitive snowflakes, unaccountable to any moral or rational standards, so that people can remain stuck, regressed, even more defensive, and egoically identified. Designed to protect yourself from criticism is the will of the ego, not the will of the cosmic adult. While there is constructive and destructive forms of criticism, the adult can handle both and let go of the destructive aspects, and carry forth the constructive ones. The belief that no one can diagnose another is the false belief of humanistic psychology. While it is true that no one can know the totality of another person, one can indeed know some things about that person based on their patterns of behavior and time spent with them. To claim that the physical wall between people also creates a psychological wall is another false conclusion and confusion, like the confusion between physical violence and verbal harm. The final D is denial, or a denial of responsibility, and this is the denial of choice and blame, such as, I have to do what the boss says. Now, this is actually important for order followers to understand, as they often believe that they must follow orders, abdicating their responsibility and choice to their order givers. This following clip is what Rosenberg got right in terms of criticizing order following, but he criticizes the fact that the language was what people used to hide from responsibility, when not taking responsibility has to do with not understanding your own sovereignty. It's not the language. The language is just you expressing what you already lack in understanding.
Denies responsibility for our actions. I use the word Amtssprache for this part, having read an interview with the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann at his trial for war crimes in Jerusalem. Eichmann was asked, was it hard to send tens of thousands of people to their death? And Eichmann answered candidly, he said, to tell you the truth, it was easy. Our language made it easy. That answer shocked his interviewer. And his interviewer said, what language? Eichmann said, in fact, my fellow Nazi officers and I, we had our own name for our language. We called it Amtssprache. Amt in German means office, and Sprache, language. I'd call that bureaucratic language. He was asked for some examples. Eichmann said, it's a language in which you deny responsibility for your actions. So if somebody asks you why you did it, you say, I had to. Then you don't feel so bad if you have to do it. You see, you're not responsible. Why did you have to, Jack? Superior's orders. Company policy. They made me do it. I couldn't do elsewise. Very dangerous language, Amtssprache. Very dangerous.
The problem with NVC is that it removes morality from responsibility, which is not true responsibility. NVC sees responsibility by simply owning what you do, not whether it is good or bad. Determining what is good or bad gets into the negative judgment and criticizing that NVC abhors. Looking deeper, isn't requesting that another person meet your needs a form of the denial of responsibility in some ways, especially when these needs come from the pampered child? Will the child throw a tantrum if these needs are not met? With NVC, needs becomes the end goal rather than truth and evolution. Humans become objectified as the fillers of needs rather than ends in themselves, generating an interpersonal system of codependence, which is antithesis to sovereignty. Is it actually moral to use people to satisfy your own needs? Is this not the epitome of selfishness? When we center our reality on our needs, are we no longer concerned with true connection, healing, truth, and reality? When people continually use conversation to make demands in the form of requests, they can still be acting as children. Self-fulfillment means what it means. I fulfill myself. Looking for other people to fulfill your needs quickly becomes a destructive cycle. Because you confront people with your unmet needs as a request that they should fulfill, and then when they say no, or they say yes but don't follow through, you head into a downward spiral, because now you have the original unmet needs compounded with new unmet needs for the request to be fulfilled. While NVC appears to be about respecting people's free choices and boundaries, it actually does the opposite. It makes people dependent to each other to fill each other's needs. It doesn't respect people's free will choice to express themselves naturally and freely by considering crossing boundaries as discussing anything that would conflict with one's needs and feelings. It is a circular loop of solipsism through social validation, following the New Age model. The social contract is, only say what fits with my beliefs, and I will do the same for you. And as a result, we will both feel good. More often than not, needs besides truth and morality are usually based on unresolved childhood issues: self-loathing, low self-esteem, insecurity, the ego, the shadow, other psychological imbalances, confusions and compulsions, and even the emptiness of spiritual ignorance. In this way, NVC merely enables one person to remain in their pathology and their neurosis, while abdicating their responsibility to self-development to another person. In regards to childhood issues, most humans on the planet are victims of bad parenting and have to parent themselves, and often during awkward and weird phases of their adult lives. More often than not, people's needs for community is their need for family healing. And if one leads a life merely driven by that need, then his ignorance and imbalance will create catastrophe. Most cultish experiences do not end well, as the glamour of a community where everyone is right and good all the time can have a short life with a devastating end. These needs can only be fulfilled with psychological growth, by determining our parental issues and purifying the father and mother archetype as the internal structure, as discussed. We must heal the mother archetype within so that we can always feel one with the divine and our deepest care awakened. When we fail to do this, this leads to controlling others or living in a controlled environment, as most demands and requests come from the corrupted feminine. Values is an expression of the feminine, but NVC associates values to needs, which we see as problematic. The lower feminine expression of the child and ego is needs, while the higher feminine expression of the cosmic adult and true self is through care. Care should be the motivating force, not needs, as being what we are actively driven to nurture and preserve out of our free agency. Needs are often driven by an inner lack and internal conflict, in which our compulsions reflect the opposite of freedom, when we cannot control ourselves. Additionally, we must heal the father archetype by gaining the control over our own mind and autonomy to value learning logic and discernment, to seek truth for ourselves without the control of false authority found in many fashionable pseudo-spiritual cul-de-sacs. Values must accompany true morals, as we should value love because it is objectively good. Another psychological need is to heal from traumatic events, and this involves facing the negative, of which NVC seeks to avoid. Rather than healing trauma, trauma can partner up with an ego, a dangerous combo, perpetuating the cycle of abuse, as victim easily becomes perpetrator. The human potential movement is all about the quick fix, but bringing out pain and trauma stored in the unconscious is a lifelong path, and one can experience very negative states for long periods of time. These states have to be felt before they can be processed and let go of, which can be a very painful and uncomfortable part of the spiritual journey. This also requires that we deconstruct our defense mechanisms, which prevent us from confronting pain as to release and free pain. But NVC crystallizes such defense mechanisms, making them harder to penetrate, encasing the traumatic wound so that it ends up being the core and motivation for everything. One not only aborts the growth process, but identifies to his wounds so that it becomes a part of his identity, and he will do anything to keep it in place and protect it. While NVC creates a superficial appearance of resolution, in the depths of the unconscious, psychological pressure builds to soon face eruption. This is why those who practice NVC may have the biggest meltdowns, as in the psyche will always desire to merge the unconscious with the conscious in the fundamental wholeness of self. True growth requires authenticity and honesty. When we have to adapt to a model of communication, we are no longer being authentic. It is much better for people to be authentic at a lower level than inauthentic at a higher level, as inauthenticity leads to no growth and keeps people hidden from themselves. The problem with NVC is that it prevents people from being honest and authentic to begin with, which is required on the path of knowledge. What if you aren't feeling super compassionate and you are feeling feelings of guilt and fear? Should you not speak? Yes, on the one hand, NVC seeks to express one's feelings authentically, such as fear and guilt. But on the other hand, it wants to filter out any authenticity that would cause pain to another, which can be fear and guilt. Essentially, it's a double bind. True authenticity is being honest with your emotional states, but NVC only wants you to feel and experience certain states, which is why you make requests to others. Ultimately, NVC limits the range of emotional reception and expression. While being against conflict, NVC fuels the conflict between the image of an ideal and your authenticity. NVC tells you that your default setting is compassion, when reality tells you differently. Like New Age religions, NVC helps one create a false persona based on a positive static ideal, which prevents individuals from looking within to face the dark side lurking in their intentions, motivations, and agendas. To summarize, NVC opposes real psychological development, the minor arcana of natural law, and the study of self, including the archetypal hero, the sovereign adult, shadow integration, gender balance, healing, mother-father issues, communing with archetypes, and mental discernment of true, false, right, and wrong. By placing focus on the means of communication, one is no longer concerned with self-knowledge and self-healing. His only self-criticism is his fault in communication, rather than something about himself, like his lack of honesty, authenticity, his lack of good intent, and right action. NVC doesn't value sovereignty or autonomy and the free will of self and others, but desires to control the rules of interaction and use of words so that one never has to reflect on themselves in any moral capacity. NVC creates the dependent and narcissistic child who wants special treatment to be pandered with modified language, designing all conversation to be centered around his needs, who wants things his way and can only interpret criticism, disagreement, and conflict as violent because it goes against his ego. This is how the New Age has actually regressed people rather than help people move forward. With NVC, one's emotional issues can remain unchecked, so he can nurture them and become more stuck and identified. One can even become more triggered by communication because he has conflated it with his own psychology. Arranging language and linguistic rules never gets to the root problem, thus fueling one's reactive tendencies. Yet most emotional reactions can be due to the lack of self-knowledge, or being confronted with facts that contradict one's delusions. To expect the emotions to be static is problematic. While some negative emotions can be indicative of self-loathing, we do not heal self-loathing by seeking to eradicate these emotions, but purge them through authenticity and seeking the truth of self, which comes from love. Sometimes we have to be in undesirable emotional states to grow and heal, but we need to understand the causal dynamics that created them. When you do the self-healing work of love, loving relationships can be formed. When that is the foundation of your life, you no longer have to focus on connection. It happens. This is about your connection to the infinite all that is ever present. Our deficiencies and insecurities are part of the materialist paradigm that views man as only his finite material self with his origin and end in this one life. This is the lie, and we never die, and we come from infinite love. When we are able to heal and find true loving relationships, then there is never the need to control. People have to be in alignment with truth and morality for real community to emerge, which must be done spontaneously and organically. When we are searching for community for some internal need, we will often become prey to the power dynamic because of our unresolved issues. When it comes to having a connection and support in community, that can only be done by first getting our house in order. First things first. Things must be right within ourselves to a degree for that to manifest without. True connection between people and individuals and community cannot occur until one has been initiated on the path of truth, learning objective morality, the basic laws of the universe, and our connection to reality based in language, logic, and methodology. And we should study language as an objective science, rather than simply the subjective tool of expression. Before true initiation, our perception will waver from truth most of the time, based in self-ignorance, leading to destructive cycles and painful events. The large group awareness training, called LGATS for short, was a phenomenon of the human potential movement that desired to combine ancient occulted spiritual knowledge with the pragmatism of the business world, which merged with the New Age movement. The goal was to combine Western and Eastern spiritual traditions with self-help, motivational psychology, holistic health, financial abundance, and material success. We see these ideas in Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, Deepak Chopra's The 7 Spiritual Laws of Success, and the movie The Secret. Also, there's Andrew Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. The bottom line is how to sell yourself and create more options in this corporate slavery hellhole. The problem is that success is based on how the world and other people perceive us, and in a codependent world based in lower consciousness and its creation of false realities, true value cannot be discerned. In truth, our value is not dependent on what other people think. Having to make your work and life dependent on other people's desires is indeed a form of slavery. And it stops people from growing, which is why the more intelligent of us seek careers based on education and information, independent from the control system. So we cannot say the proponents of these theories had all bad intentions, as freedom is still part of their theme. The problem is that it becomes co-opted back into the system when no real transformation of consciousness has occurred, in which we still seek its phony enlightenment and play its silly games. When we value the wrong things, we simply bring upon more enslavement. The pragmatic models of the LGATS created cult-like environments based on the principles of cybernetics, systems theory, NLP, hypnosis, general semantics, modern linguistics, structuralism, and constructivism, while their philosophical teachings would be based in existentialism, pragmatism, humanistic psychology, and progressive education. We also need to include mind control, certainly, and game theory, which connects psychology to postmodernism and pragmatism.
When you're hanging out with your friends, you probably don't think too hard about the math behind the decisions you're making. But there is a whole field of math and science that applies to social interactions. It's called game theory. Game theory was pioneered in the 1950s by mathematician John Nash, the guy that Russell Crowe played in A Beautiful Mind. But game theory isn't about games the way we normally think about them. Instead, a game is any interaction between multiple people in which each person's payoff is affected by the decisions made by others. So sure, that could apply to a game of poker, but it could also apply to practically any situation where people get together and get up in each other's business. Like, did you interact with anyone today? Well, you can probably analyze the decisions you made using game theory. Game theory is incredibly wide-ranging, and it's used all the time by economists, political scientists, biologists, military tacticians, and psychologists, just to name a few. Game theory has two main branches: cooperative and non-cooperative or competitive game theory. Non-cooperative game theory covers competitive social interactions where there will be some winners and some losers.
Let's see how these theories tie together. In short, these postmodern psychological theories, like cybernetics, are about controlling groups of people by thinking of them as collective systems to tweak by controlling information and the environment while steering behavioral outputs towards desired ends through the process of communication, feedback, and redirection. Here, Paul Pangaro tells us the basics of cybernetics at a 2018 conference, as I wanted to find something recent to show the tenacity of this mind virus that is over 70 years old now.
So, what is cybernetics? It's the art of steering. I know that sounds surprising, and it has something to do with control. Maybe control is kind of a loaded word. We don't like the word control. But it has to do with steering because cybernetics is a word that comes from the Greek word meaning to steer. And not just to steer in any old way, but to pilot carefully to get to your goal. So imagine that you're a ship and you set out toward your goal, but you're blown off course by wind and tide. And so you correct, right? There's a difference between where you want to go and where you're going, and you see that difference. That difference is called feedback. So cybernetics is the art of getting what you want.
So what could be more tragic than that, than expressing ourselves in a way that gets in the way of our getting what we want?
It's the art of steering, of having a goal, aiming toward your goal, and using feedback to get back. So it's this circular process. In the case of a boat, it's seeing where you are compared to getting into the port and adjusting the rudder to go in the right direction.
I want to make a quick note here that it says correction of error, but know that this means the error of deviation from the initial course. True error correction is not dependent to the initial course, which this model makes confusing. The initial course could actually be an error. In a sense, cybernetics, systems theory, and the rest are a proxy for the Trivium process of information processing, as it poses to be a metamodel when it is quite the opposite. In this actual model, information is gathered from objective reality as the input, and this can be sensory perceptive data or data in the form of language, as in communication and literature. The individual processes the information through analysis and then takes actions back into the environment. If garbage goes in, then garbage comes out, which is why misinformation and propaganda is unleashed at a massive scale into our environment by dark forces. This is so that our actions are not in alignment with objective reality, but with their nefarious agendas that provide a narcissistic reward and ego payoff. But here in this cybernetics model, you begin with an agenda, develop a plan to implement, and then get your results to examine. If your results deviate from the initial goal and agenda, then you adjust, correct, and steer back into the agenda. Now some may ask, isn't it okay to create goals to execute? The answer is of course yes, but goals are the smaller context that must cohere with the larger context of objective morality. Even though the pragmatist admits that objective reality exists, Because he recognizes that he cannot achieve his goals without having some objectivity about his situations, he still denies objective morality, because he thinks that everything is based in context and that time changes context, failing to get the paradox of the law of change. They haven't purified their spirit to seek knowledge and evolution beyond their ego contraction. Additionally, goals must be adequately contextualized, as goals aren't the whole of life, which cybernetics tries to make. Astrology divides the archetypes of life into 12, in which achievement is merely one. But even this Capricorn archetype has a lower and higher expression, in which the worldly achievement reflects the lower mountain goat and the spiritual enlightenment the higher sea goat. At the lowest, Capricorn is the businessman, but at the highest, the priest. And as an astrological side note, we all have this archetype in our chart, regardless of whether our sun sign is in Capricorn or not. We could say that we have goals in all areas of life, but evolution is not necessarily goal-making, as we cannot conceive higher expressions of being and goodness from the level we are at. We cannot dictate what our evolution will be in this sense. This is another reason why apophysis is the true method of growth, eliminating what is false instead of projecting what is good. The main problem here is that cybernetics model is a fake meta-model that eradicates the true evolutionary goal to perceive objective reality and objective morality, which should be our fundamental aspiration. This is why relativism always underlies these theories, so individuals don't examine the moral value of their agendas in their environmental systems. If the business is making profit, then all is well. Here is another Maslow-type hierarchy applied to corporations, which again reveals the problems of humanistic psychology and its concept of needs. Here the need to be profitable is above all else, as ethics is placed at the top. The irony is that by pursuing profit, we create poverty, as reality reflects the quality of our consciousness. A consciousness based in profit is a consciousness based in meaninglessness. The truth of the cybernetics model is that negative feedback can inform individuals where they are actually wrong, but only when our goal is to perceive objective reality and objective morality and seek to act in alignment with it. When we make our relativistic desires the input, our output is necessarily social systems of manipulation. Natural law is about freedom from the false self-concept and the collective hoax it creates. And this is the model that is used by corporations, media, education, and government, all driven towards the agenda of totalitarian enslavement, which includes getting the population to be driven by their own selfish lower desires to play the money game, the business game, the political game, the fame game, all the hierarchical games you can think of, as playing these games reinforces lower consciousness. We think Nietzsche's Superman is true sovereignty, when it is not. People think that they are becoming more free the higher they go in the socio-political economic hierarchy, but really the more enslaved their souls become. Most often, the proponents of these theories have the agenda to gain rank in the dominator hierarchy, to be financially supported as intellectual theorists. While on some level there is a desire to learn, it gets co-opted and one remains stuck in a crystallized belief system of half-truths, framed to support collective lies. Take, for example, Jordan Peterson, who fuses the cybernetics model with religious allegory. Today he is a member of the Trilateral Commission, founded by, yours truly, David Rockefeller. Stay tuned for my upcoming book critiquing Peterson in full. When we think our agendas are equivalent to reality, we have collapsed reality into a self-serving tool, when we are actually here to learn about reality. Reality is here to teach us much, much more beyond our agenda. True purpose requires our connection to objective reality. Even when we fixate to good goals, we can easily become obsessed by them when we identify to them and allow them to give us a sense of power and control rather than purpose. But ultimately, life is about surrendering that control to become holistic. More than worldly achievements, life is about deepening what we perceive and who we are and what we do, moving in unplanned directions through spontaneous evolution, and helping others in the world at large by uniting the individual with the universal. We have to be receptive to what we are here to learn, which is beyond what we think we know or know. And our personal agendas can kill that receptivity. The irony is that when we are aligned to our true purpose, that is aligned to natural law, we need no models or tools of manipulation to get there. We are supported by the divine itself, and a path organically unfolds for us. Often, when we are exerting a lot of control, it is to try to get something to work that maybe isn't supposed to. The ultimate goal is evolution of consciousness towards the infinite all itself, not the social and financial rewards of achieving goals. Beyond that, we do not steer evolution, we increase our degrees of participation in evolution by increasing consciousness of what is and discovering what needs to be done. We align to the intelligence in creation, not our finite intellect. The steerer of the ship is the all itself and that aspect within us that is driven to the ultimate. Okay, so returning to the LGATS, let me give you a brief history. These essentially started in 1968 with Alexander Everett's Mind Dynamics. Everett is sometimes called the father of the human potential movement, attempting to unite esoteric philosophy like Theosophy and Rosicrucianism to get people to a higher dimension of mind and bring about transformation for one to be more successful and fulfilled. Werner Erhard was an employee of Everett's Mind Dynamics and basically took Everett's staff and information to create EST, Erhard Seminars Training. Erhard publicly announced this at the end of one of the Mind Dynamics trainings. While Everett acted supported in the matter for public face, he was for obvious reasons upset, as according to Everett, Erhard did this behind his back. If this story is true, this is an example of pursuing a goal with no regard for morality. Before that, Erhard was a car salesman, and we will find that sales is the basis for much of these teachings. EST started in 1971, and it is estimated that 700,000 people did EST before the seminars halted in 1991, when Erhard left the country and sold EST technology to some of his followers who established Landmark Forum, where Erhard's brother is the president. The company makes over $50 million yearly with a staff around 500. I will be interjecting my own personal experience here, as I have taken the entire Landmark course, which includes the Forum, the Advanced Class, and the Self-Expression Leadership Program.
Landmark Education is an international training and development company that helps people gain an awareness of the basic structure in which we know, think, and act in the world. Each year, over 200,000 people in 20 countries participate in Landmark courses.
To go on a short but related tangent here, Erhard was one of the founders of the Hunger Project in 1977, along with John Denver, which became a United Nations organization. The initial goal was to increase the awareness of hunger issues and have a conversation about its root causes, not to actually end hunger, and we can see why this stirred controversy. A 6-month investigation by the Center for Investigative Reporting of Oakland, California, and Mother Jones magazine found that very little of the money collected for the Hunger Project was used for the purchase and distribution of food, claiming that Erhard was, quote, using the Hunger Project not only for self-aggrandizement, but for promoting the for-profit corporation he founded as well, end quote. It is suspicious that the Hunger Project has attempted to purge criticism and history from the internet, seeking to not be affiliated with Erhard as its founder. When you look into the Hunger Project a little deeper, of course they are doing some good, providing some training on agricultural techniques to third world countries, but not without an agenda, which is called microfinancing and banking. Here in Moses' story, we see that they gave him a small loan, which is a scam as it is creating value out of nothing. Like the entire banking system, they are creating financial dependence so that you owe them the fruits of your labor when they have created nothing. A look into John Perkman's Economic Hitman can give more information on the matter in regards to banking in third world countries. Okay, back to Erhard. Erhard was also close friends with Alan Watts, who really brought Zen Buddhism to the Western crowd, combining it with psychotherapy. Now, Alan Watts was definitely a mixture of good and bad teachings. He understood the law of mind better than some, deconstructing materialism here.
And I read a great deal of theological reasoning about the existence of God, and they all start out on this line. If you are intelligent and reasonable, you cannot be the product of a mechanical and meaningless universe. Figs do not grow on thistles. Grapes do not grow on thorns. And therefore, you, as an expression of the universe, as an aperture through which the universe is observing itself, cannot be a mere fluke.
Yet here he reveals his lack of understanding of morality.
The whole thing is seen like this. Just as I was discussing the balances of a garden in which the birds eating the worms and the snails eating the lettuce, all these processes of conflict build up the ongoing miracle of the garden itself. So in the same way, things that you see in yourself as neuroses, as forms of ill health, as things that you shouldn't be, they are your slugs and worms. And there is nothing at all in your whole being that's unnatural. All of it is an integral part of the game. And if you weren't as awful as you are, you might be creating very serious trouble. Now, I don't want to say that so that you can say in turn, well, let me be more awful still. You know, St. Paul got all tangled up in this. He, having explained that without sin there could be no grace, he said, shall we then sin that grace may abound? And his Greek, you know, mi genito, heaven forbid. But this is, of course, a problem that simply has to be faced. The universe, in its grand design, has nothing special to do with morality. Or rather, no more special connection with morality than with anything else. Morality is a part of the universe. It's a way of playing the human game. But the thing itself is really beyond good and evil. Now, as I see it, that's the way it is, and whether one likes it or not, it's always still up to you how you want to behave. If we try to get people to behave decently by scaring them and saying that if they don't behave decently, they'll be out of sorts with God, this doesn't help at all, because it merely inculcates a new kind of fear and a new kind of false basis for morality. One can only be moral because you like to do it that way. There really is no other reason whatsoever. And to try and find other reasons always perverts morality. In just the same way, the powers of the universe, the power of fire, the power of electricity, the power of steel, they are neither good nor evil. You can use either one for the blessing of people or for their destruction. And so the truth itself, I mean, the foundation reality of the world is something like that. Although it does have this certain edge to it, and so does all human activity. And the edge is something like this. Those powers that we call positive are always in a process of overcoming those that we call negative. It's the nature of the positive to win, and the nature of the negative to lose. But win and lose always go together. Nobody wins unless somebody loses. Nobody loses unless somebody wins. Their relationship is transactional in the same way as buying and selling. But if it were the other way round, you see, if the negative were always in the situation of overcoming the positive, you would get a universe that would not be a continuing game. It would be 100% tragedy.
It is interesting how at the end there, we have a bit of game theory mixed in with the spiritual concepts of good and evil, but ultimately Watts fails to see goodness as the fundamental principle of the cosmos, seeing it more like a necessity just to keep the game going, as he desires to go beyond good and evil in a Nietzschean Buddhist pseudo-transcendent way. Calling spirituality a game is erroneous, as it isn't about winners or losers. That's the game of ego. In the common New Age Buddhist way, he uses the law of polarity as a justification for evil, conflict, and suffering, tending to fuse morality with religion, seeing it separate from spirituality, and he confuses moral polarity with gender, seeing good and evil as mutually dependent opposites. Watts even calls preaching moral violence, which is quite a dangerous thing to do, and is very reminiscent of NVC, which considers moral judgments to be violent.
The whole lesson of history is that preaching doesn't work. That preaching is really a form of moral violence, of trying to change human conduct by saying, look, if you don't mend your ways, there's going to be a terrible thing happen. Either the police are going to catch you, or hellfire, which is of course the celestial police force, is going to catch you, or a dreadful doom is going to occur. And so the preaching lesson is no good. The only way to change human behavior is to woo instead of preach, to make love instead of threatening disaster, to point out how glorious something could be, and in some way to live it. And this is the real, if it has any meaning and if it has any guts to it, the idea of make love, not war, would be to live here and now, starting today, a magnificent life.
But Watts's explanation is that preaching is futile, as people don't change when you tell them that what they are doing is wrong and will bring about negative consequences. Yet this doesn't make preaching violence, just ineffective according to his view, which is strange that he would use such strong language. It also reviews the performative contradiction in all moral relativism, as he is preaching to not preach. Anytime we share important knowledge that others don't have, we are in a sense preaching, and this is even how Watts has loosely defined it, as the preaching of moral causality. Yet even if it seems futile to change the world with knowledge, it is still the right thing to do, but you have to understand the principles of morality first, and the few people you can help make all the difference. This belief that preaching is moral violence goes directly against the great work and the spiritual alchemy of apophasis. This belief is another attack on knowledge. Watts claims that we change behavior with positivity by just working on ourselves and making our individual lives great, and we can see how this directly feeds into the New Age movement of ignore the negative that created a culture of narcissism.
Deception number 13, enlightenment is only about changing yourself. One of my biggest pet peeves in the whole New Age community. It's all about just individually in changing yourself. Once you change yourself, that's enlightenment, it's okay. Well, enlightenment is a shared experience, ladies and gentlemen. Your own little pinpoint of light isn't going to do so well if the whole world is full of darkness. So it is our shared responsibility to educate our fellow man. See, and the end goal of enlightenment should be to feel good all the time. That's what I call feel-good spirituality. There's nothing balanced, there's nothing tempered. It's all about, I'm going to live for my deepest desires and try to live the best personal fulfillment possible about what I want to achieve and what I want to get and what I want to own. People think that's enlightenment somehow. You know, it's not about service to self. It's not about feeling good. The most enlightened people in this world right now don't feel very good about what they see, about what is happening. You know, you're probably much more likely to be an enlightened person if you're pretty damn upset about what's going on here on Earth right now. Just worrying about yourself and thinking that enlightenment's only about you and what you want to get out of things is bullshit. It's not what real enlightenment's about, folks. Enlightenment is about service and responsibility to truth above all else, all other modalities, even service to others. The truth of the current human condition should make you feel uncomfortable at this time.
False Buddhism takes things to the extreme, in which selflessness becomes the no-self, anatman, or when getting in touch with the ground of all being means total passive acceptance for everything as being divine and perfect, or the rationalization for evil as being necessary for the good. The law of polarity is no excuse to allow evil to run rampant, but should be the will to make things right. False teachings are often half-truths that fail to see the paradoxical nature of things, such as between what is and what ought to be. Also, Mark mentions the problems of false Buddhism in correlation with the New Age in his fake-ass Christian seminar, like the idea that meditation is the path to enlightenment, when in reality, humans have to take action to gain and embody spiritual knowledge in order to change the negative life conditions in which we subsist. Alan Watts was able to open up spaces in people's minds through a more holistic analysis on life, and Earhart claimed that Alan Watts helped him differentiate the mind from the self. And this probably means that Earhart was pretty identified with his mind, and so his space of being was opened up to him. While the path of true enlightenment regards disidentification to limiting self-concepts for evolution and internal freedom, Earhart's goal was to leverage this freedom for opportunism and as a selling tactic, ultimately. Probably a little more extreme than Alan Watts, Earhart and Landmark go the Buddhist nihilist route as the core of their philosophy. And we will get into this soon. As a side note, with my level of research, I think Buckminster Fuller may have been the best from the humanistic potential crowd, as he understood the problem of evil and the self-serving agendas of all human systems that in turn create chaotic destruction to nature and inefficient design that is actually mostly waste. Strangely, when you are driven for profits, you create waste and zero value. Large group awareness trainings include AST Landmark, LifeSpring, LifeStream, Life Results, Life Success, and New Perspectives, Context Trainings, PSI World, Arc and Life Dynamics, Personal Dynamics, Meditation Institute of Milwaukee, Actualizations, and Insight Seminar. These training groups would attempt to combine profit business with self-improvement, self-awareness, and self-transformation. What makes these groups particularly attractive is that they are presenting information and education outside of religion and academia, an eclectic blend that does include occult esoteric aspects. Yet these aspects are repackaged with a modern agenda, giving it a new age flavor. Ultimately, it is about adapting to our current conditions with useful ideas, rather than discovering the causal factors for suffering in general. as it never seeks to uncover the nature of evil via apophasis, which is necessary for true spirituality. Because the agenda is to grow the company and extract profits, this distorts true spiritual teachings, keeping people in a lower vibration for pseudo-evolution. Consequently, many LGATs would be criticized for pyramid schemes and selling techniques termed coercive persuasion by cult researchers, as customers would be recruited into members and then pressured to hard sell everyone they know.
Let me tell you, the most dark side of large group awareness training is actually the hardcore selling, the hardcore enrollment. Now, like I said, there are some beneficial concepts they teach. I mean, there's no doubt there are benefits taught by Landmark, by LifeSpring, by AsiaWorks, and groups like this. But the big but is this. Coaches have a very deceptive way of camouflaging the hardcore selling, and they actually present it as a twisted concept called enrolling skills. That they say you need enrolling skills in real life. You need it to enroll people to your vision, to your projects, to your career. So they use it as a survival skill, as also a mastery skill. So they say that in order to survive, you must have enrolling skills. And then they slip in this thing that they go around the room asking for enrollment figure. They'll go, I know there'll be some large group awareness training people out there that will want us to remove their names from the cult list, but I will not do that. Only when you stop this practice of hardcore selling, I will remove it personally. Until you do that, I will haunt you to stop this practice. I'm a coach myself. I'm a cop, but you must prove to me. If not, I will haunt you to do the right thing. You are a disgrace to the training community.
Right.
So these
Landmark molds you into a kind of super person, but rather than sending you forth to take the world by storm, they lobby as hard as they can to enroll you into working not with them, but for them, like an indentured servant, via the manipulative tactic of conflating what's at stake in your personal life to your effectiveness and productivity at bringing them fresh meat to enroll. Their technology is effective, but the price you pay for the training lies far beyond the dollar amount. They demand a ridiculous amount of your time. After taking the course, you're invited to become a coach for the following term, empowering you to take that same course again and again and again.
Stay in the conversation.
Introductions to the Landmark Forum are going on all the time, so you can expect to be pestered almost nightly to come in to help love bomb, set up chairs, and lay out pens and registration cards just so. The Landmark way. So more and more guests will feel touched, moved, and inspired to register for their 3 days of brainwashing.
What I want to do today is describe to you a very unique and sort of devious language pattern that I discovered. This particular language pattern is used very effectively by those people at Landmark Education, also known as Landmark. All in all, I personally believe what they do is generally good. What I've discovered is they have used a very unique language pattern. And incidentally, if you're not familiar with it, I am the author of Mind Control Language Patterns. You can get it on Amazon.com. What the whole language pattern they use is based around a single word, and that word is enroll. Look at the definition of enroll. It's pretty straightforward. To write the name of a person in a roll, or register, to place upon a list, to register. All right. Well, what Landmark Forum does, and they do very effectively, is they help establish people a sense of purpose for an individual. And I think that is, in fact, a very positive, beneficial thing. When someone has a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, life becomes a little bit more focused. They know exactly what they need to do. They tend to respond with less petulance and anger, and they make healthier decisions. All right. So once a person, usually in the first seminar that they attend, establishes a sense of purpose, they start talking about developing a plan to help fulfill that purpose. Once you have that plan, they're going to say, okay, there are people in the world who you're going to need to enroll and in your purpose, in your plan. And of course, that's true. You start using this word enroll in that context, and it becomes, well, makes sense. Yes. And with that sense of purpose, they start talking about how you're going to enroll people. Well, of course, you're going to enroll people by describing what it is your plan is and sharing the enthusiasm. That's all very well and good. Now, here's the devious thing. With that word enroll, what happens is you become desensitized to it. You start to use it as part of your vocabulary to mean to join, but it has many other meanings. So what happens after you start to think of how you're going to enroll people in your purpose? The people over here at Landmark Forum, they start talking about enrolling people in the seminars. Now, those two things, your purpose and the seminars, are linked together. You start to see Landmark Forum as a direct a direct connection to your purpose. And of course, you're going to enlist people in your purpose by enrolling them in Landmark Forum seminars. And as a result, Landmark Forum seminars have huge volunteer rates. Well, it's almost all volunteers. There are very few people who actually get paid, and it's all...
Now, this was first explored by a professor at MIT by the name of Edgar Schein, and he published works, a book about coercive persuasion in 1961. And Schein said, literally, there are 3 phases to coercive persuasion. Break them down by whatever means necessary, break them down, and then change them, and then after having changed them, freeze them. So he would call it unfreezing, changing, refreezing.
I just wanted to say that my experience of Landmark definitely followed this threefold path. The breakdown was very intense. Many people cried as their traumas were surfacing, and it became a huge therapy session. People were making confessions and coming clean with themselves about their deepest, darkest troubles. Landmark reforms you by teaching you how to reframe all those experiences on the basis of nihilistic meaninglessness, which we'll get to later, and this gives you a feeling of freedom, which mimics healing. Recall in part 2, we talked about cults imitating healing so that you bind your unresolved issues, trauma, and victimhood to it. This is exactly what Landmark does in order to recruit volunteers. It freezes people in a state of codependency.
When I got home, I did this big debate that night, and I did a lot of reading online about Landmark because I was like, is this experience unique? What about these chairs? And as I started reading, I started seeing the patterns, and then it really scared me because I thought, first of all, even from that first day, guess what? 60% of the topic was about us registering for the follow-up forum and for the I forget what they call it, like the advanced course and all these things. Yeah, even from day one.
Day one.
A lot of the
They've already got you.
Yeah, but a lot of the content was already about that.
Jesus.
And so I was like, I see. And the more I read about it, I started seeing, okay, number one, they absolutely do use these very, very kind of weird psychological torture manipulation tricks. Don't like that. Number two.
You read about that?
I read about that online. And I read accounts from people and stuff like that. Number two, it's going to continue. The sales pitch is never going to end.
Right.
Number three, they actually go through this process on Saturday and then Sunday that sounds somewhat risky psychologically. I wasn't so much concerned for me, but I didn't want to support that because I had heard these people tell these very difficult stories, and I was like, yikes, man. And they're in a room full of strangers, 100 strangers they've never met, and they're blaring open all these problems. So in the end, I decided that night, I made that deal with myself, and I said, I'm going to get something out of this weekend in my own terms, and that's what I did.
It's a great story.
In part 2, we talked about the APA. Mind control expert Margaret Singer wrote a report for the APA about LGATS and their unethical use of coercive persuasion as a form of cultish mind control. But the APA and its Board of Social and Ethical Responsibility for Psychology rejected her report, considering it non-scientific. Singer and Associates subsequently sued the APA and a group of scholars and lawyers in 1992 for, quote, defamation, frauds, aiding and abetting, and conspiracy, end quote, and lost in 1994, having to pay $80,000 in attorney fees for the defense. While I admire Singer's courage for going against this elitist institution, sadly, this is what happens when you try to use man's law to get justice from the organizations they serve. Here, Scientologists attempt to discredit Singer on the basis that she was rejected by the APA, which is appeal to authority, considering her part of a hate group against religion. Here they give all the cases where the judicial system and academia reject the validity of brainwashing. But of course, for those very institutions are dependent on it. Singer then took the material from her report and wrote, "Cults in Our Midst." She was sued by Landmark for defamation. Landmark also sued Rick Ross, who had Landmark listed as a cult in his cult education websites. Landmark guards their reputation like a hawk, which is considered one of the first principles of power in this book, The 48 Laws of Power.
Most cultic groups differ from altruistic and educational groups in our society because the primary purpose of cultic groups is to gather more members and to gather more power and money for the cult leader, so that it's primarily the promotion of the cult leader rather than the growth and development of the followers.
In his book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, Robert J. Lipton provides 8 criteria for brainwashing thought reform. The first is milieu control, the control of information, the control of the environment, and the control of human communication. Thus, we see why communication has been a theme here, as with nonviolent communication and cybernetics. Before we examine some of the teachings of Landmark, which parallels other LGATS, let's look at the connection between LGATS and cybernetic systems theory models. Recall that the bones of this model is input, analysis, and output, the 3 aspects of living truth. But with LGATS, we have controlled information that consists of corrupted spiritual teachings, like moral relativism, along with the agenda of the company, which follows any other company to support the self-serving interests for those at the top. We have the purported agenda to help the customer's development and improve the quality of their lives, and then the hidden agenda to sustain the company as a collective and grow it by gaining membership volunteers to sell the program. Ultimately, your self-development will be seen as your contribution to the collective. This is the mini control system, with the goal of wealth and power at the top and exploitation at the bottom. Look familiar? Along with controlled information, individuals are put in a stressful environment. As in Landmark Forum, there are 12-hour-long days, 3 days in a row with only 1 meal a day, in which you are pressured to not take breaks.
So why the long hours you say is like 10 to 10 or even to midnight? Why? Because it's a very psychological warfare they do. They're trying to, put Humpty Dumpty on the wall, push them to the wall, stress them, pressure them. But trouble is, Humpty Dumpty may fall and break his head. So I've seen many people emotionally bruised, spiritually bruised, that they need a lot of counseling. I myself counsel many people from this type of groups. So the long hours to wear down the participants so that they won't resist anymore and they will just listen.
There is also an environment of peak aha experiences, which are amped from the stress.
And it's composed of milieu control, which is control of the environment, everything you see and experience. Then mystical manipulation. Things appear to happen spontaneously, but in fact they are really contrived, scripted, and not spontaneous.
This all goes into the individual who takes action at the end of the course, and their actions are seen as desirable when they are in congruence with the collective's agenda. And this takes the form of agreement, participation, especially enrollment, recruiting other members and giving more of your time and energy by taking another course, going to the next level, or volunteering. Desirable behaviors are conflated with self-awareness and self-improvement so that the members deem their own so-called evolution as their ability to manifest these behaviors, and especially influence others to manifest these behaviors. On the other hand, undesirable behaviors are not in congruence with the collective, and so the members attempt to redirect you back into the system. This is when NLP and the tactics of communication are used to try to find your weak spot, your need, and vulnerability, which relates to nonviolent communication. Notice how need is present here in the cybernetics model. By controlling needs, one can attempt to redirect exiting members back into the system. If one does not succumb to the redirection process, then he is seen as giving up, not enlightened, or failing to understand the spiritual ideas taught. And he can even be seen as an outcast and ignored when we get into the more cultish religions.
Landmark will allow you to leave, but prepare for staff and all your friends with whom you have traumatically bonded to bombard you with guilt and shame because they've been brainwashed to believe that your free will decision to leave Landmark means nothing less than you have completely and utterly given up on your own life. I find it sad that people are so narcissistically abused, myself included, that they willingly turn their lives over to an organization utterly lacking in regard for the individual beyond their useful idiocy in unquestioningly following orders and slavishly delivering results for the team. The groupthink is absurd. The culture is pathological.
Let's talk about redirection for a sec. Maxwell Maltz's book, Psycho-Cybernetics, was also a basis for Erhard's Est and the human potential movement as a whole, closely linked with humanistic psychology, as specifically the psychology of success. Here he talks about negative feedback in a torpedo missile model.
Servo mechanisms are divided into 2 general types. 1, where the target, goal, or answer is known and the objective is to reach it or accomplish it. 2, where the target or answer is not known and the objective is to discover or locate it. The human brain and nervous system operate in both ways. An example of the first type is the self-guided torpedo or the interceptor missile. The target or goal is known, an enemy ship or plane. The objective is to reach it. Such machines must know the target they are shooting for. They must have some sort of propulsion system that propels them forward in the general direction of the target. They must be equipped with sense organs, radar, sonar, heat perceptors, etc., which bring information from the target. These sense organs keep the machine informed when it is on the correct course, positive feedback, and when it commits an error and gets off course, negative feedback. The machine does not react or respond to positive feedback. It is doing the correct thing already, and just keeps on doing what it is doing. There must be a corrective device, however, that responds to negative feedback. When negative feedback informs the mechanism that it is off the beam, for example, too far to the right, the corrective mechanism automatically causes the rudder to move so that it will steer the machine back to the left. If it overcorrects and heads too far to the left, this mistake is made known through negative feedback, and the corrective device moves the rudder so it steers the machine back to the right. The torpedo accomplishes its goal by going forward, making errors, and continually correcting them. By a series of zigzags, it literally gropes its way to the goal.
Now, this relates to the larger agenda of the New World Order, which is implicit in the hierarchical models that underlie business, economics, politics, education, media, and advertising. When results deviate off course, this is sometimes called negative feedback, and redirection is sometimes called co-option, and the creation of controlled opposition. The Occupy Wall Street is an example of redirection and controlled opposition, funded by Bilderberg billionaire global elitist George Soros. The human potential movement has also been co-opted as the New Age, as initially it was about spiritual awakening and soon became about supporting the control system. While Landmark comes pretty close to a cult business, Scientology is a full-on cult religion, and also contains many similar ideas as a mixture between Western psychology and Eastern mysticism. When prolific fiction author L. Ron Hubbard lost the rights to his book Dianetics in a bankruptcy, he created a religion to better seize profits under non-taxable status, and more pressure could be exerted on its members without scrutiny.
What is Scientology? How would you describe it?
Well, it's very interesting. You've just asked a question like, what are the contents of the Encyclopedia Britannica? Answer in one word.
Dianetics attempted to delineate the metaphysical connection between mind and body as to eliminate blocks in the unconscious and resolve psychosomatic illness. And while this is part of the true work of healing, sovereignty is required for healing, which is stifled in any cult-like environment that uses specific language. Being manipulated by so-called religious authority is a block towards consciousness growth. Hubbard has said that Scientology, quote, forms a bridge between cybernetics and general semantics, end quote, and we have seen how cybernetics is used to create cults, to create a system of control, and we can consider Scientology one of the most aggressive informational control systems in the New Age movement, which actually records all activities of its members to use against them if they try to leave.
Because they're a total business. Everything that you do in Scientology, you have to pay for. Everything. They have one seminar that I used to put on, which is a free Dianetic seminar. That's it. After that, I mean, even the free stress test. Right away, they're trying to sell you a Dianetics book. That's the beginning of it. And that's what Scientology is. If you want to join the Sea Org, it's a slave camp. That's what it is. You work, and you work, and you work. And they tell you how much you're helping mankind. How? You question it? Uh-oh. You're off to ethics, baby. And if you keep at it, you're off to the RPF, which is the super slave camp. And I'm talking.
Werner Erhard was also interested in Dianetics to use for selling techniques. Allegedly, L. Ron Hubbard was furious with Erhard, who he believes stole his ideas to use in Est without giving him a slice of the pie. According to Erhard, Scientology engaged in a 20-year campaign designed to destroy his reputation. This is another moral problem of combining spirituality with business, as people are trying to own and control information in a cutthroat competitive environment to make money, when truth cannot be copyrighted. One of the first things they tell you at Landmark Forum is that morality is off limits and a topic they will not address, which is a big red flag. And while they act as if they are not denying its existence, eliminating it from their models reveals a performative contradiction.
Landmark, they don't want to mention Buddhism because they know that it will provoke a lot of Christians. Because to a lot of Christians, it's about good and bad, right and wrong. So they spend 2 to 3 hours explaining and getting you to understand that there is no right or wrong. They just didn't want to have a right in the classroom. Okay, so let's moving on.
To add to our earlier discussion, I would state that moral relativism is a misteaching of Buddhism, just like moral relativism is a misteaching of Western philosophy. Now, this person's analysis on Landmark is not about the veracity of the content, which is what I am discussing here, but about Landmark not crediting their sources. Now, intellectual property is their commodity. Commodifying knowledge just leads into all sorts of problems, which is why Western philosophers always create a philosophical system with their name on it. The problem is that there is no non-contradictory structure underneath.
As it says here, the work is not about solutions or answers, it's an inquiry into the nature of being. In the process of this inquiry, insights show up that profoundly impact the quality of our lives. So that's the nature of transformation. This particular way of getting at these questions does not produce answers, does not produce solutions, does not produce recipes, does not produce prescriptions. What happens is that certain insights occur, even though you don't get answers, certain insights occur in the process of this inquiry using the invention, transformation, to get at these questions. Certain insights will show up for you. Now, the insights don't show up necessarily as, oh, I see something I didn't see before. Because that would be kind of like an answer. The insights show up rather than like that as actual openings or a space for being or a freedom or an empowerment in your everyday being in the world.
In this clip, Erhard reflects on being like the existentialist Heidegger as to not seek answers, but to activate a field of being and open up the imagination and possibility to usher in more creativity, success, and productivity. Existentialism and pragmatism go hand in hand. Existentialism so-called frees up a person from metaphysical restraints, and pragmatism comes in to capitalize on it. However, this is not true freedom, as it is not being steered by the right spirit, and metaphysical restraints are only against falsehoods and evil itself.
That metaphysics better not be messing with my cash flow.
Let's tune Heidegger up a bit. When we question being and its meaning, it's not that we are creating meaning, because if we were just doing that, then there would be no question. To truly ponder is to seek meaning beyond our personal fictions. The journey has meaning because objective meaning exists. Pragmatism asks, what do I need to believe in order to create a particular response and generate a particular result? It is about applying our defective scientific method to interior consciousness, which is always driven by agenda instead of truth. Thus, pragmatism doesn't ask, what truth do I need to gain to evolve? As sometimes truth may not provide us with immediately gratifying results, and thus it cannot deconstruct any lies such goals are built on. Here is an epistemological matrix of knowledge, ignorance, conscious, and unconscious. Erhard's transformational technology focuses on the area of knowledge of what we do not know that we do not know, which is wisdom from the ancients, like Socrates, to bring into awareness that which is beyond our frame of reference. Now, the interesting truth in this statement for the advanced Hermetic students is that knowing nothing actually means knowing that nothing does not exist, as the highest level of apophysis, and that all exists. And it is the reference point of the all that allows us to gain spiritual knowledge and evolve. This is, in a sense, tapping into the law of mind and the potential of the infinite. But rather than attempting to gain and share truth and knowledge, which expands our consciousness and is the vehicle for real evolution, the purpose here is to tap into possibility to create self-serving opportunities. Yes, spiritual principles can be used pragmatically, but until we eradicate the control system as a whole based on our selfishness and lack of universal care, we simply become more efficient pawns in the immoral games of business and politics. The lack of care for objective morality and care for objective knowledge will bring one upon an existential dead end. Another existential premise of Landmark is that there is no inherent meaning in the events and facts themselves, that humans invent meaning.
In the programs, they talk a lot about emptiness and nothingness, so that life does not have an inherent meaning, that things are just the way they are because that's just the way they are. That's pretty much how the forum ends up. And then the advanced course ends up pretty much along the same lines, that words don't have any meaning either, except the things that we give to them, and that reality is the only thing that supersedes existence, and that words really don't mean anything, and that you're free to kind of create yourself and free yourself from all of this, and to kind of view everyone as a unity instead of seeing yourself as separation. And that's stuff I agree with totally.
Their Zen-like distinction of empty and meaningless sounds like a great tool for letting go of old thought patterns that no longer serve you. But the way they want you to think about things is the way they want you to think about things.
Recall the 3 stages of cultish thought reforms and how they break you down to remold you. Here, existentialism is their tool to do that. And while Landmark uses nihilism to deconstruct people's perceptions and how they assign meaning, Landmark definitely wants to reform you to associate Landmark as the ultimate meaning, in a performative contradiction, by making you think that the epiphany of your healing is based on their teachings, which is nothing other than diluted existentialism. You form a traumatic bond to them. I'd like to give a shout out to my partner Noah, who described the psychological mechanism behind Landmark after me telling him about Landmark in a few short sentences. What they are doing is a form of intellectual rape, where they are robbing you of the value of your experiences and the value of your suffering, so that you transfer your codependency and victimhood onto them. What happened to me is that at the end of the entire course of the Self-Expression Leadership Program, which was about a 4-month period, is that my deepest trauma had emerged, that I had been hiding from my whole life regarding a sexual assault. And what I was experiencing could not be whisked away with psychological games and linguistic manipulation. So I didn't attend the final classes, as intuitively I knew Landmark was not an avenue for true healing.
It was found that psychiatric issues may be triggered by EST.
Yeah.
So if you have PTSD, schizophrenia, dissociation, absolutely that is going to be a problem. Yeah. And it's something that existential therapy and narrative therapy historically has sort of ignored. It's one of the criticisms of those forms of therapy. So because they're just like, well, it's just a story you're telling yourself that you've gone through trauma. You know, again, narrative therapists today, existential therapists today wouldn't say something like that, but they did in the past.
Yeah. As an example, if I was in the class right now, I would have been told, as I was describing what happened to me in that recruitment session and then in that first day, I would have been told, okay, that's the story.
Right.
But what happened? And then I would have been forced to eventually narrate something like this, saying, I went to a class that I paid for. I went to one day and left.
Right.
And that's what happened.
Right.
And you strip out all the actual nuance of what you felt and all these kind of things. And I understand. And I actually was finding some of that way of thinking interesting, because I kept thinking, okay, so if I look at some of the bad things that happened to me in my life, I could look at them through that lens and say, like, okay, well, my mom left when I was little. And I was raised by my dad. And that's different than saying I was deeply traumatized that day. But I find usefulness in both of them, not only one.
Right. Yeah, it can be helpful to, essentially it's an exercise of changing your perspective.
Right.
If you have a perspective that your life has been shit and that perspective makes you depressed, then in a very simplistic way, if you change your perspective that your life was not shit, then you might be less depressed.
Right.
For some people, that does work.
Yeah.
I have worked with people in that way before. But to reduce all of your, every person's problems to that kind of premise is, pretty short-sighted.
Existentialism confuses nothingness with unity, like false Buddhism confuses emptiness with the all. This is nothing more than the nothingness and emptiness of the material paradigm itself. The reason this is so effective is because people are holding on to so many false beliefs and false narratives about themselves in reality that the existential purging brings a sense of freedom. This is why Nietzsche saw nihilism as the basis for the Superman. But in reality, we can only become free from what is false, not what is true. And at the highest level, truth is freedom. Additionally, this meaningless technique makes people acutely aware of their free will over their thoughts, feelings, and actions when they remove the influence from the external world. And while sovereignty is taking full responsibility for our thoughts, feelings, and actions in this way, we do not create where we came from, the source of the cosmos itself, and we do not create what is objectively true and what the cosmos is inherently about. Nihilism is the result of scientific materialism, obfuscating the law of mind.
But in the late 1800s, some thinkers started to challenge the idea that we are imbued with any essence or purpose. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, embraced nihilism, the belief in the ultimate meaninglessness of life. But by the mid-20th century, the path had been paved for French thinker Jean-Paul Sartre to return to the question of essence and ask, what if we exist first? What if we're born without any hardwired purpose, and then it's up to us to figure out our own essences? Well, this became the framework for what we now know as existentialism, and its mantra is the claim that existence precedes essence. In other words, our existence, our birth, happens first, then it's up to each of us to determine who we are. We have to write our own essence through the way we choose to live. But we have no actual predetermined purpose. There's no set path that we're supposed to follow. It's hard to express.
To existentialists, the idea that we create ourselves from nothing was seen as empowerment, but ultimately this is an illusion. To make our consciousness the totality of the cosmos ultimately leads to solipsism and reduces what purpose is. In a way, existentialism was the height of philosophical arrogance brought forth by scientific materialism and the belief that man's intelligence surpasses that of his creator. If existential emptiness were reframed to be true, it would merely be apophysis, eliminating the negative instead of making the negative the endpoint. While phenomenologically there may be a feeling of freedom in recognizing the so-called inherent nothingness of the cosmos, ultimately this belief will lead one into darkness of ignorance that no amount of success can conceal. When there is no meaning behind our arbitrations, then there is no meaning. And if all is based in nothingness, then it ultimately means nothing. The twisted Buddhist theme appears again. All materialistic ideologies are in a sense theories of nothing, and if metaphysics is truly nothingness, then there is no divine origin, no eternal truth, no real sovereignty or real self. All of those principles are deeply interconnected. With the foundation of nihilism, modern linguistics takes importance and the premise that language constructs reality, as we can change our language to change reality. If people just change how they say things, they can alter the meaning and thereby be more effective in changing events. Now, there is some truth to this, especially pertaining to our emotional spirit and attitude, but unless we attempt to be more accurate and precise in how we think and communicate as to align words to reality, aligning words to goals will ultimately enslave us in a subjective prison. When the distortion of spiritual principles is used for ego and unexamined lower desires, this can only result in more pain and suffering. Until we understand the lessons of altruism and the higher purpose we serve, the more aligned to natural law we become, the more altruistic our mind, spirit, and actions become. Simply, materialism is suffering, and this is what happened to me after my landmark experience. After I manifested so many opportunities and friended a successful group of artists in Los Angeles, my soul was deeply suffering, as pursuing the values of success were indeed based in superficial nothingness. I ultimately left that life and lived in poverty in my car as a street artist, where I discovered real happiness.
I quit in protest 8/10 of the way through the Introduction Leaders program because my coach was the psycho bitch from hell who ripped me a new one for joining a conference call 30 seconds late.
Don't you care about transformation?
While the rest of the group sat there just chilling, as if to agree that that level of insanity was okay. I'm sure the grief she so generously heaped upon my head was a lot like what her own coaches dumped on her. And this cracker factory purports to be a self-help program. I find it sad that people are so narcissistically abused, myself included, that they willingly turn their lives over to an organization utterly lacking in regard for the individual beyond their useful idiocy in unquestioningly following orders and slavishly delivering results for the team. My landmark experience began with being love-bombed, seeing exciting breakthroughs, and learning useful tools and tech. My landmark experience ended with the ugly, bitter feeling of being lied to, ripped off, and bled dry.
My landmark experience ended in a very similar way to this woman's, as I volunteered for the advanced class because I wanted to hear the information again. But I ended up having to be the servant for the coach leader who was worse than Meryl Streep in the movie The Devil Wears Prada, and I make no joke about that. This woman was so egotistical, selfish, entitled, and rude, I was in utter shock at the caricature of the experience. But I stayed the first day to challenge myself to deal with such a person. And feminists actually want to get rid of the word bossy, because bossy is an understatement here. Man, are we headed into darkness.
You're fucked up, bitch.
The next day I was so disgusted in seeing everyone completely bend to this woman's so-called authority that I walked out in revolt. She called and apologized to me to try to get me to come back as her reputation was at stake, and she of course used the landmark rhetoric. Later, the landmark company called me twice to hear the story and also apologize to me. The thing is that if you just do things right in the first place, then you don't have to spend so much energy on reputation control. But there is no objective morality in Landmark Forum. There is no right and wrong. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick video analysis. I wanted to get some type of recent conference that explores the ideas and ideologies that we've been talking about. I'm going to discuss the problems. And here we have Werner Erhard, who created S, which became Landmark Forum, which I just talked about. And he's doing a talk with this man from Stanford University, who is James Doty. And this man desires to gather all information about compassion and bring it to the Research Institute. Okay.
What people, we go about and live our lives and we think that's a life. And the result of many times is that we stop really seeing. And then we expect a lot of others after we've created this narrative. One of the things that we were talking about, excuse me, I got some salsa, was that, we have these experiences in our lives and we think how we register that experience is the picture of the experience, right? But what we forget is that that experience is actually a canvas that we paint. And we paint it with our emotions. And then that gets cataloged, and every time we look at it, it's not the event, it's how we painted the event. And it was interesting, and this was really brought forward to me one time as someone really was explaining this to me, and they said, so you're sitting with somebody who's very aggressive towards you, but if you really had insight and put yourself in their position, you would agree that you're an asshole. And suddenly this light bulb went on that, in fact, we think our narrative is the correct narrative. And when we talk about ruthless compassion, it's not to diminish, I think, our experience per se, but to understand that an event in and of itself has no power whatsoever. It is the emotion that we paint it with that gives us power over our life.
See, that's the fundamental of relativism. No events and no facts of reality contain any value in and of themselves. It's all in our perception.
And what was freeing for me was at the age of 12, a woman gave me that insight. Because in my own situation, I felt, and I tell people, I felt like I was a leaf blowing in the wind. Because I had no control. I was 12, my father was an alcoholic, my mother was an invalid, she was chronically depressed, had attempted suicide, we were on public assistance, we had been evicted, we didn't always have food. And I won't tell you that because I kept saying, well, either there's something wrong with me or this event occurred and it was their fault. And this is a tendency we all have to do, or have to act this way. And after...
Maybe it was their fault. his parents do have a responsibility to take care of their child, and they're obviously not. So, this is another problem, is that the irony is that these types of seminars, they want to teach people how to take accountability, but then they don't hold people accountable. It's like they only hold people accountable for their perceptions, but not their actions.
Spending time with this woman at the age of 12, which is mentioned in my book if you want to. I suddenly realized that, again, I had painted all of these experiences that made me a victim, that allowed me to sit and say, well, if only this happened, or I can't do this because that didn't happen, or I had this immense anger towards all of these people about my situation. And then suddenly after...
Maybe anger is an appropriate response. If you're a child and your parents are not taking care of you, like, you have a right to be angry. This is another thing of the New Age, like all negative emotions, because they don't have a practical value and they make life more difficult, we should just try to reframe reality so we don't feel them. In reviewing this, I also want to reiterate the fact that when someone tells you that your suffering is meaningless, that's just evil. Like Noah said, they are robbing you of the value of your life experience as to prevent you from gaining any wisdom from your suffering.
After this, when I got this insight, I was angry at anybody. And it was this most incredible gift. It wasn't to say these weren't bad.
So this man supposedly healed from all his anger just by changing his perception.
Experiences on some level, but I wasn't angry at the events, and I was allowed to just see them and to sit with them. And really, that fundamental experience, which I think in so many ways is what the work that you have done, was what released me from my prison. What I found was that when I changed this narrative I had created, which had anger, hostility, actually fear, and took that away, I did not understand what I was doing in my environment, because how I stood, how I reacted, how I responded had an effect on every other individual who interacted with me. And so when I no longer reacted that way to the world no longer reacted in a negative way to me. And that was freedom, I think. Yeah. And,
So that's what he considers freedom, is basically taking a pragmatic approach where you should just choose the narrative that serves you, that makes your life good. And this is not real evolution of consciousness. This is not real healing. This is a quick New Age fix to completely do spiritual bypass and, solve problems instantly, without any work. Now, of course, these seminars are very expensive, and so people have to pay a lot of money to go to them. But it's kind of like, paying for your enlightenment, but you're not really going to get enlightenment. Enlightenment requires time and attention. And so here, Werner Erhard is talking.
And I'd like to see us make available to each other a new meaning for what it is to be human. And that leads me to a more practical entry into it, and that is, who am I really? And it's not who am I really, but who is this I that's all over the place, all over the room, really?
So essentially this idea of the new human is very reminiscent of Nietzsche and existentialism. And, because there is no actual essence of what it means to be a self. There is no actual essence. It's whatever you create, so there's this positivism that's involved here.
What is it to be I really? Or what is it to be a self? And, one of the things that got loosened in that experience coming across the Golden Gate was the importance of I and the centrality of me. And so it's been 50 years, I don't know, it's so long now, I can't remember, exercise of discovery. And that is a large part of what has generated the kind of work that I do. I avoid figuring it out. And I've learned to, I'll say it a couple of different ways, I've learned to sit with it or just look at it. So most people say, well, this is good thinking. No, this is good looking as far as I'm concerned, good seeing. And
so a lot of these New Age technologies are about, trying to be in that observer position and not so attached to identifying to what's going on. And we do want to become more aware of what is occurring within us. But we have to want to become aware of truth. Otherwise, what are you becoming aware of? We want to become aware of what the true self actually is, instead of, being caught in our narratives, making up things and having stories. Let's get to the actuality. Let's discover what really is.
It takes some time to be with it, to sit with it, to just perceive it, just look at it, see what arises in being with it.
I'd like to interject something else while I was reviewing this, and that is, while existentialism took a nihilistic turn, one of the positive things from the movement is that it started to uncover the true spiritual nature of the self. Here, Earhart is talking about the idea of spiritual hide and seek that Alan Watts talked about. The bottom line is that you cannot objectify the self, and it can never become an object of awareness, although the attributes of consciousness can. The reason is because the true self is spiritual and infinite, not material or finite. But because existentialism ends with nihilism, this thought exercise of never being able to find the true self is utilized for pragmatism, to ultimately create efficient Superman slaves for the control system.
But when we got to the event, she sheepishly told me, I looked all over, I couldn't find the damn thing.
To give you context here, Earhart ends on the punchline of his story, in which the woman whom he presented the exercise of finding the real self to discovers that there is no real self. Sounds postmodern, eh? But listen to Earhart's bottom line.
Now, that one's pretty tough, to give up this significance about I, and to give it its proper place, which is, okay, life is a game to some degree, like Monopoly, and you got to have a piece to play, like a Scotty dog or a top hat or a race car. And this I is useful and a piece with which to play the game. I probably said way too much.
No, not enough.
So he basically ended with game theory, that, the I is the piece to play a game. It's all about looking at every social dynamic as a situational game, to win. And of course, these types of more right brain, feminine investigations, they want it to be a win-win for everyone. But that's utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is kind of the feminine side of pragmatism. But even in seeking for everyone to win, unless it's rooted in objective truth and morality in natural law, is relativistic. And you're basically aligning to the wrong principles. And there will be negative consequences for that. Essentially, what these individuals are doing is they're just interjecting points here and there that come from their range of studies to rally up the crowd, to get the crowd to feel things, to incite emotions in the experience of awe. So there is no underlying framework to any of this, and no analysis of whether there are contradictory ideas here, which there certainly are. It's just, say whatever sounds interesting at the moment. A person like this man who's trying to do scientific studies on compassion at Stanford University is a person who's trying to generate and engineer compassion from the outside rather than do the work on the inside. Now, at this point, Warner talks about integrity, and this was something that was part of the landmark education that I learned.
So we are running out of...
And what's up with this? They have to clap after every little thing that they say. It's this constant social validation. You're wonderful. I'm wonderful. We're all wonderful. But it's such the display of interior deficiency. Now I'm not saying like let's not celebrate and be happy. We can do those things, but
time, but that's okay. Warner, talk to me about integrity.
Well, it's really, again, I always have to tell people I don't say nice things.
So this is what I particularly liked about Landmark and its commitment to authenticity, even at the expense of offending others. Erhard here says that he doesn't say nice things, and this obviously contrasts with NVC. Recall that Landmark is the masculine version of NVC, but the goal is still the same, to get what you want from people and from life. Landmark uses authenticity as a tool, but not as the path to understanding the self and to gain self-knowledge. I just want to make a point that the problem with the authenticity teaching is that Landmark wants you to become authentic, and this is when people reveal their trauma and their life experience, and they make confessions, which is characteristic of a cult-like environment. The purpose for this is to have a deeper connection with the real you so that that connection can be exploited, though. So while Landmark can help people become more authentic, as it did for me, ultimately, if you do not leave the cult or stop playing into the cultish aspects of the program, your authenticity will be manipulated.
Which means, by which I mean, you can trust what I say. I'm going to be straight with you. And in the beginning of the work that my colleagues and I were developing, integrity became a really fundamental expression of having gotten past the way you wound up being. That is to say, you could be counted on for your word. And so that was around for a very long time. Then I met a extraordinary economist, academic economist by the name of Michael Denson. And Mike is, I think, or at least he was at one time,
You notice how they only work with other successful people?
the most referenced economist in the whole community. Mike's a really, really bright guy, but he had a transformational experience, and he became interested in making that more available. But then he got really fascinated with this integrity stuff, and what fascinated him was, sorry, I'm going to use economic language here for a second, I'll try to explain it.
But never morality. See, Landmark Forum, no morality, only integrity.
He said that the way in which we treated integrity made it a positive phenomenon. Now, positive for most of us sounds like something good, except for an economist, it's not something good, it's simply the way it is. So integrity for most people is a good idea, something you ought to have, something it's good to have, something that nice people have, but and not nice people don't have. But as Mike and I have been working on this, I think 10 years. The last paper we wrote on integrity was putting integrity into finance.
Wow, that would be nice.
And I have to tell you, it was accepted by a pretty prestigious journal called Capitalism and Society, the editor of which is a Nobel laureate in economics. So we're starting to make a few little inroads. Anyway, let me tell you what integrity is a positive phenomenon, is a description of the way things work. So I'll do this really fast. Integrity is defined as the state of being whole, complete, unbroken, sound, and perfect, never mind the rest of it. And so something is either in that state or it isn't. An object is either whole, complete, unbroken, sound, and perfect condition, or it isn't. The system likewise. And a person as a person. Now, I'm a person as a body, and my body's either whole, complete, unbroken, sound, and perfect condition, or it isn't. And if it isn't, there are consequences. The consequence of being less than, I'll use the short phrase, whole and complete, is a diminution, a lowering of workability. Things don't work well when they lack integrity. That is to say, when they're less than whole and complete. Pretty obvious. And workability is all you need. Sorry, let me get this straight. Whole and complete is all you need for workability. And workability is either an opening or a limit for performance. It's not the whole story about performance. You need something in addition to workability. But as workability goes down, the opportunity for performance goes down. And that's integrity as a positive phenomenon, as just the way things work. So people who allow their integrity to diminish wind up with a lessened opportunity for performance. Doesn't mean they don't perform, because you can get a bicycle with a missing spoke to perform really well if you've got a champion bicycle rider on it. But as you reduce whole and complete, you reduce workability. As you reduce workability, you reduce the opportunity for performance. And so that's, in 2 seconds, Mike and I are in the process. Sorry.
Okay, so yeah, integrity is just workability. It's all pragmatic. You know, you have to have your thoughts and your actions, your feelings in alignment together to actually get something done. And relates to what Mark Passio calls the dark unity, that if you're not aligned to morality, but you have integrity, that, you will be able to manifest your results, because in the way that he puts it, the universe respects integrity, whether it's light or dark. And so this is the problem here, that if you have integrity without morality, you basically have our control system, the dark occult priest class, which is why morality has to be combined with integrity. So in this diagram, we have unity between the mind, spirit, and action. But the central point in which they all rest is false. When we align all aspects of ourselves to the wrong thing, like false ideology to a cult or community, to our ego and self-interest, we indeed have a higher so-called success and sustainability rate, just by virtue of our unity. However, because these in the center are false values, they cannot last, and there will be eventual crisis for the soul, whether in this life or the next. And this goes for the entire control system. Even though it seems like they are winning, they cannot conquer nature, they cannot conquer love, they cannot conquer what is. All evil agendas come to an end, but the truth we find and live is eternal. And if, your thoughts aren't aligned to what is objectively true and good, if your feelings aren't aligned to what is objectively good and true, if your actions aren't aligned with what is objectively good and true, then you're not in the real integrity under natural law. Spiritual principles can be used for good or evil, but if we are lost in moral relativism via nihilism, they will most likely be used for evil, since the life conditions in which we live are ruled by evil. Dark occultists consciously use spiritual principles to enslave humanity. Lower consciousness using higher principles is a very dangerous thing. Thus, glimpsing into a principle itself does not qualify as the totality of understanding, as the spirit behind our knowledge matters. The evil genius stops short of his true intelligence because his spirit is not right, which limits his intellect. So the control system is engineered by the self-interests of the dark occultists, and while there are very few of them, through their dark unity they successfully imprison humanity. Now most of humanity has no unity, as their mind, spirit, and actions are not in alignment, and also they are based in error, but they participate in the control system based on their self-interest as well. While there are degrees of evil and degrees of knowing what evil is, when our mind, spirit, and actions are aligned to selfishness, we create slavery, individually and collectively. We not only feed into the monstrous control system of fake money, fake value, and fake authority that is total spiritual devastation, but we enslave ourselves, because living in falsehood burdens us, confines us, imprisons us, period. Now the light occultists may be just as few as the dark occultists, who see the illusion of the control system by evolving their consciousness. The great work is our attempt to lift the average mode consciousness of the entire planet. So I really hoped you enjoyed this series. Please show your support by liking and subscribing. Much more to come. And a special thanks to those of you who have donated and made this possible.